Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a really fascinating and I think sometimes quite challenging exploration.
Hmm.
We're looking at how American compassion has sort of shifted throughout history.
That's right.
The source material for this, something you specifically asked us to look into, is the book The Tragedy of American Compassion.
Hmm.
And it offers a really thought-provoking way to examine how we approach helping those in need.
It really does. This book takes a long view, looking back at how poverty and charity were dealt with in America's past, and, well, it draws some pretty sharp comparisons with how we do things today.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it kind of pushes us to think not just about how much we do, but whether our compassion is, actually effective, hitting the mark.
Absolutely. And for you listening in, our aim with this deep dive is to give you a real handle on some complex historical views on compassion without you having to wade through all the original stuff yourself. We're basically on a mission here to pull out the key insights from this book. How did Americans in different times understand compassion? What did it mean to them? And, what might surprise us about the differences between then and now?
And the author uses a real variety of sources. You get firsthand accounts, observations from travelers, especially from Europe, charity reports from way back, and records of these really intense debates from different eras. It paints a very detailed picture.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start right at the beginning with the early American model of compassion. What really defined how people helped each other back then?
Well, in those early days, compassion was fundamentally tied to the local community, very local,
Yeah.
and to strong religious beliefs. It was super direct, personal interaction.
Like neighbors helping neighbors.
Exactly. Neighbors supporting neighbors in very tangible ways. Much later in the 19th century, Francis Peabody looked back and said, charity used to be as simple as a well-informed neighbor just stepping in to help.
That really paints a picture of a tightly knit society, doesn't it? Where everyone kind of knew each other's business.
Yeah.
In a good way, maybe, and could step in.
Yeah, I think so.
So a key insight here seems to be this link between community, personal responsibility, maybe even spiritual growth in how compassion worked, which feels quite different from today's often more secular, maybe more individual approaches.
Definitely. And this closeness, this interconnectedness, it really struck outsiders. D. Griffiths Jr., he was traveling in Ohio in the 1830s, and he wrote about how few beggars he saw compared to England.
Hmm.
And he chalked it up to these small communities and the strong influence of religious ideas. Tocqueville also noted this. He talked about the easy and frequent intercourse among Americans, fostering this sense of mutual support.
So it wasn't just about, say, giving food or money. There was a moral, maybe even a spiritual layer to it.
Oh, absolutely. Very often, providing material stuff, food, shelter, whatever, went hand in hand with moral and religious guidance. The New York Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, the AICP, they stated flat out in 1854 that for real prosperity, you needed Christianity pervades and renovates the habits of social and civic life.
Wow.
They genuinely believed you had to address what they saw as the spiritual roots of poverty for any lasting change. That's quite a contrast to our modern focus, which is often mainly on economic factors,
It's
right?
hugely different, yeah. And I understand there was also this emphasis on something that might seem really surprising now, sometimes actually withholding charity.
Yes, that's right. It sounds counterintuitive, maybe, but back in the colonial era, you had figures like Cotton Mather warning against just giving indiscriminately.
Why? What was the concern?
They worried it would just encourage idleness or even wrongdoing. Charles Chauncey also stressed how important it was to distinguish between people who could work and those who genuinely couldn't support themselves.
So being in need didn't automatically mean you had a right to get help.
Not quite automatically, no. There was a really strong emphasis on personal responsibility and on values like, hard work, planning ahead, forethought, self-control, self-denial.
Hmm.
The goal wasn't just to fix the immediate problem, but to build up the virtues they thought would prevent hardship down the road. So a core idea was that early American compassion aimed to build independence.
Okay, so let's move forward a bit. America starts urbanizing. Cities are growing fast. How did this sort of individualized, community-based model hold up when faced with bigger cities, more anonymity, more complex problems?
Yeah, that was the challenge. The rapid growth of cities brought huge new problems and, frankly, a lot of anxiety. People looked across the Atlantic to England, which was further ahead in industrializing, and saw their experience with outdoor relief. That's aid given to people in their own homes, not in institutions.
And they didn't like what they saw.
They were pretty concerned, yeah. They worried it could foster dependency, that it could be easily, exploited by people who weren't really in need. So this key question emerged. How do you maintain that discernment, that careful judgment, when communities get bigger and more anonymous?
It sounds like they were already wrestling with debates we still have today
Mm,
about welfare maybe creating dependence.
exactly. Some of the earliest attempts at organized charity in New York City really highlighted these problems. There was an evaluation back in 1843 of some early relief efforts.
What did it find?
Well, it concluded that while there was definitely a need for help, a lot of these initiatives weren't building real personal connections with the people they were trying to help. And they weren't doing a good job distinguishing between genuine hardship and what they saw as just laziness or unwillingness to work.
That importance of personal connection just keeps popping up, doesn't it?
It was seen as absolutely crucial. There was this deep belief that the most vital help involved trying to bring about a change in someone's whole worldview, often seen through, well, a religious lens.
Yeah.
Charity workers often felt that until, sound moral principles and Christian values really took hold in society, there wouldn't be a lasting fix for poverty.
So the role of the charity worker was different then, not just handing out resources.
Right. They often saw themselves more as facilitators. Someone named Ruffner put it nicely. He said the goal was not to stand between the giver and receiver, but to bring giver and receiver together.
Okay.
The ideal, in a way, was for the city to somehow copy the countryside in its sense of discipline, mutual care, strong social bonds. It wasn't just about moving goods. It was about a human connection aimed at, well, moral uplift.
And there were some pretty unique and actually massive initiatives during this time to tackle urban poverty, weren't there?
Oh, indeed. One really fascinating example was this widespread practice of sending children to the countryside.
The orphan trains.
Essentially, yes. The Children's Aid Society, led by Charles Loring Brace, believed that vulnerable kids in the crowded, tough conditions of Manhattan would do much better in family environments on farms out west.
And the scale was huge, right?
Astonishing. Between 1853 and 1893, they moved almost 92,000 children. It's quite something to think about the logistics, but also the trust placed in those rural communities.
Wow, 92,000.
Uh-huh.
Were there checks? Ways to make sure these kids were okay in their new homes?
Yeah, they did have safeguards. In those smaller rural towns, local committee members often knew the families taking the kids personally.
Okay.
The placements were also pretty public, so hopefully abuse would be noticed more easily. Plus, agents from the Children's Aid Society made regular visits to check on the kids, looking for signs of overwork or neglect. It wasn't perfect, of course, but it seems like severe abuse wasn't rampant in that specific program.
Okay, so we see this early model adapting, maybe struggling, with city growth. But when did people start really pushing back or seriously questioning this evolving approach to charity?
Well, by the mid-19th century, you definitely start seeing a growing backlash against more formalized welfare, especially government-funded aid.
What were the arguments?
Critics argued that providing subsidies, government handouts, led to a decline in individual character. It fostered idleness, created what one writer called hereditary paupers. They felt it undermined the necessity of industry, forethought, and a proper self-denial.
Hmm.
So a key debate really started to heat up. Does giving aid actually help in the long run, or does it maybe hinder someone's well-being?
Sounds like that tension between individual responsibility and maybe broader social factors was really coming to a head.
Absolutely. And the famous debate between Horace Greeley and Henry Raymond, two really influential newspaper editors at the time, captured this perfectly.
How so?
Well, Greeley believed poverty was mostly caused by social oppression. He was pretty optimistic about human nature, thought people were inherently good, and argued for, basically, wealth redistribution.
Okay, the societal structures argument. And Raymond.
Raymond took the opposite view. He emphasized individual moral failings, humanity's inherent sinfulness as the main drivers of poverty.
Right.
He argued that personal effort and moral change, guided by a higher law of righteousness, were key. He even saw competition as a good thing, pushing people to work. So a fundamental disagreement about the very nature of poverty itself.
So their whole worldview shaped their ideas on poverty and what to do about it.
Exactly. And around this time, you also see a growing focus on intemperance, drinking too much alcohol as a major cause of poverty. A New York legislative committee in 1857 figured it played a role in something like 70% of the cases in poorhouses.
And that perception probably fueled worries about who was actually deserving of help, right?
Precisely. Lots of people started believing that government aid was increasingly going to the unworthy poor folks seen as able-bodied but just unwilling to work.
Uh-huh.
Newspaper editors, like in New Haven and Henry Raymond at the New York Times, argued really strongly for private charity instead. Why? Because they thought private groups could do a much better job assessing individual needs and character.
More discerning.
That was the idea. The AICP also spoke out strongly against things like soup kitchens, worrying they just encouraged dependency without tackling the root problems.
And were the government aid programs back then known for being particularly efficient or clean?
To put it mildly, no. The whole era of Boss Tweed in New York City is a perfect example of the corruption that could infect government help.
Right. Tammany Hall.
Yeah. Tweed's political machine did give out some aid, sure, but it was all tangled up with political favors, kickbacks, outright theft. There was this growing feeling that these big impersonal government programs weren't really reaching the truly needy and were just ripe for abuse.
Okay.
And that created an opening for different approaches, ones that stress more accountability and that personal connection again.
So the stage was set for something like the organized charity movement.
Exactly. The Charity Organization Society, or COS movement, really took off in the late 19th century as a direct response to these failures. Failures of both indiscriminate government aid and, frankly, some indiscriminate private giving, too.
What were their main ideas?
They championed a few key principles. First, affiliation building strong connections between givers and receivers. Second, categorization, carefully figuring out who was worthy and unworthy. Third, discernment, being really thoughtful about how help was given.
Okay.
So the big takeaway from the COS seems to be this early recognition that you need discernment and that just handing out aid without thinking can have real downsides. A debate we're still having, you know?
So it was more structured.
Yeah.
Maybe, from our perspective today, a bit more judgmental.
You could say that in some ways, yes. They developed what they called the labor axiom as a key test for getting aid.
Meaning?
Basically, was the person willing to do as much work as they were physically able to? They even tried giving loans instead of grants sometimes.
Loans. Did that work?
Apparently it did sometimes. The Buffalo COS reported a surprisingly high repayment rate. The idea was to test good faith and encourage self-reliance. It was a very deliberate move away from the give and ask no questions approach some had criticized.
That's a pretty big shift from just pure benevolence.
It is. Josephine Shaw Lowell, who was a big leader in the COS movement, argued you had to look at actions objectively, not just good intentions. She believed giving carelessly could actually hurt people by undermining their independence and character. But she also stressed the vital role of volunteers in providing, as she put it, the precious element of human sympathy and tender personal interest.
So it wasn't all just strict rules, and were there actual examples of this working on the ground?
Oh, definitely. In Baltimore, for instance, the Association for the Improvement of the Condition of the Poor had thousands of volunteers making regular home visits.
Wow.
Their focus was really on promoting self-help for those who could work, helping with addiction, finding jobs, while also giving material aid to those who genuinely couldn't work, like widows with young kids.
Okay.
Even religious groups got involved in this more organized way. Synagogues and temples, for instance. Groups like the United Hebrew Charities really emphasized helping people become self-sufficient. And they tried to tackle compassion fatigue by showing donors that their targeted approach was actually working.
Now, alongside this organized charity movement, what about the more traditional religious missions? Did they keep playing a role?
Oh, absolutely. Churches and religious groups stayed incredibly active in providing social services. But you see a noticeable shift in their approach, too.
How so?
They generally moved away from what they started to see as wholesale, blind almsgiving. Instead, there was a bigger emphasis on personal patient instruction in religious principles. They believed real, lasting change came from spiritual transformation.
Okay.
So you still see this focus on tackling the perceived root causes of poverty, but now often framed very explicitly in religious terms.
So providing help became closely tied to evangelism.
Often, yes. Baptist churches in places like New York and Cincinnati, Presbyterian churches in Buffalo and Pittsburgh, inner-city missions like St. Stephen's and St. Louis, they all combined practical help with religious outreach.
Right.
They set up orphanages, schools, all sorts of aid programs, often reflecting the specific beliefs of their denomination. Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Catholics all had efforts going.
And this period also saw some really powerful stories of individual change coming out of these religious efforts.
It really did. The story of Jerry McAuley and the Water Street Mission in New York is probably one of the most famous.
Tell us about him.
Macaulay was, well, a former criminal and alcoholic who had this profound religious conversion. He then dedicated his life to helping others trapped in similar situations. His mission, right in a very tough part of the city, became this powerful counterexample to the social Darwinist ideas floating around then.
Social Darwinism being.
The idea that society progresses through competition, survival of the fittest, Macaulay's missions show that even people who seemed completely lost could find redemption and turn their lives around. The philosopher William James even wrote about the incredible conversion of an alcoholic named Samuel Hadley at the mission.
So these inner city missions, they weren't just about giving a meal and a bed, they were aiming for deep personal transformation.
Exactly. That was the core goal for missions like Chicago's Pacific Garden Mission, DC's Central Union Mission, Boston's North End Mission. They relied heavily on volunteers, private donations, and their success stories offered a really compelling alternative to the more pessimistic views of the time.
Okay, so as we get into the late 19th century, what were reformers seeing? What were their takeaways on poverty and how well these different approaches were working?
Well, someone like Jacob Riis, famous for documenting poverty in New York with his photography, even he, seeing the worst of it, still called New York the most charitable city. Why? Because he saw this incredible eagerness among residents to help.
Right.
And he pointed out that some groups were having real success guiding families towards independence without just relying on handouts on alms.
And these charities often use those work tests we talked about.
Yeah, they became pretty common. Able-bodied men might have to chop wood, women might work in sewing rooms. It served two purposes, really. It helped sort out who was willing to put in some effort, and it also helped preserve dignity for those getting help. But there was still that clear line drawn between the worthy and unworthy poor, and a lot of suspicion towards people who might just be trying to game the system.
So the warnings against just giving stuff away without thinking, that theme continued strongly.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
You had influential people like H.L. Wayland criticizing what they saw as harmful and indiscriminate charity. The idea that intelligent withholding could actually be a form of true compassion really gained ground.
Interesting phrasing.
Yeah. And there was constant emphasis on getting long-term jobs for those who could work. People who begged but wouldn't work were often viewed very harshly, even called social cannibals in one instance.
Wow. Okay. Now, heading into the 20th century, we start hearing more calls for the government to step in again.
Huh?
What drove that shift back towards government involvement?
Well, while private charity was still dominant, some people started arguing that government had a necessary role, especially for large-scale organization and just marshaling resources. Thinkers like Stanton Coit made that case. Plus, there were these really bitter fights in the 1890s over public money, going to religious orphanages, sectarian warfare, basically. That pushed more people towards supporting state-run institutions, taking religion out of it.
Right. So practical organizational needs
Yeah.
and maybe trying to avoid religious conflict.
Exactly. It highlights this growing awareness that maybe purely private efforts had limits when facing massive social problems.
But was there still resistance, concern about government overreach?
Oh, yeah. Even Charles Loring Brace, the orphan train guy, a huge believer in private initiatives, he warned about the great danger for all charities. What danger? That the focus would shift too much to just material aid, brick and mortar, and away from character development, the spiritual side. He worried government would just take over as the main engine of social progress if the focus shifted from, as he put it, souls to stones.
But were there groups that managed to blend the spiritual and practical well during this time?
Yeah, the Salvation Army is often cited as a great example. They really emphasized spiritual change as central to their work, but they also provided very practical help and focused hard on building good work habits, creating paths to self-sufficiency.
Okay. And then comes the social gospel movement. How did that change the conversation about poverty and compassion?
The social gospel was a really significant shift, yeah. It fundamentally challenged a lot of the traditional religious views on poverty. It emphasized a belief in the inherent goodness of people and argued that poverty wasn't primarily about individual sin or failure, but was mainly caused by flawed societal structures. This idea got known as social universalism.
So the blame shifts from the individual to the system.
Largely, yes. The focus moves away from individual moral failings as the main cause towards looking at these bigger systemic issues.
And what did they think the solution was?
Well, proponents of the social gospel saw government as a really important tool, a tool for reshaping society, for reordering things to make sure everyone's basic needs were met. Thinkers like Fremantle saw government as having this potential to uplift everyone.
And did this lead to new kinds of organizations?
It did. The settlement house movement is a key example. Think of Hull House in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams.
Right. How are they different from the earlier religious missions?
Often they didn't have a specific religious affiliation. Their focus tended to be more on political action, social reform within neighborhoods, providing education and resources.
Right.
And these settlement houses, with their focus on tackling the material and political aspects of poverty alongside the personal, they really became a big inspiration for later government social work programs.
So moving into the early 1900s, what other changes are happening in how compassion is understood and practiced?
Well, you see this growing push for better coordination among all the different charities. Some people eventually started arguing that organizing charity effectively was really a job for the city government, a municipal function.
Yeah, interesting.
You also get new debates popping up, like over mothers' pensions, basically, early welfare for single mothers.
Yeah.
People had very different views on whether that would help families or actually undermine individual responsibility.
And the media starts playing a bigger role in shaping these debates.
Absolutely. Newspapers, magazines, they become much more influential in swaying public opinion. This helped push through some early welfare laws, like there's mothers' pensions and the creation of the Federal Children's Bureau.
Uh-huh.
Interestingly, even as government got more involved in welfare, private charity efforts also kept growing during this period.
So it's a time of real flux, lots of changing ideas about who should be responsible for helping people.
Definitely. And there was also a kind of philosophical shift happening within social work itself. Some started talking about a new social work religion focused on service to humanity, but not necessarily tied to any specific religious beliefs. Some social work leaders even started calling for radical changes to the economy, forming a labor party. And another trend, the book notes, which is maybe a bit concerning, is a decline in direct personal involvement in charity, especially among the wealthy.
Okay, then boom, the Great Depression hits, this massive economic crisis. How did that affect these long-held ideas about unemployment, self-reliance, the role of welfare?
Well, during the Depression, even with the incredible scale of need, there was still this strong preference in society for temporary work relief programs like the WPA over just direct cash handouts.
So that idea of earning your keep was still powerful.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But for many social workers who'd been pushing for permanent government social programs, people who believed in that social universalism idea, the sheer crisis of the Depression was a huge opportunity.
An opportunity
To really advance their agenda, to say, look, the old ways aren't enough. We need permanent government-led systems. So the crisis really acted as an accelerant, a turning point. Can you explain how that sheer scale of need sort of forced a rethink and sped up the move towards government intervention?
It sounds like the Depression basically forced a more fundamental shift in how Americans saw the government's role in providing a safety net. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yes. There were major efforts to educate the public about the importance of professional welfare work. The understanding of social problems continued to shift, with more emphasis on the idea that they came from faulty wealth distribution.
Right.
And programs like the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, became absolutely central to Roosevelt's New Deal. They did a lot of good, built infrastructure, gave people jobs, but they also had critics who pointed to inefficiencies, potential for political influence, the blurring lines between real need and, well, maybe taking advantage. That debate never really went away.
Okay. So after World War II, the economy recovers. How did attitudes towards welfare continue to evolve then?
Well, even after the New Deal had massively expanded government programs, there was still quite a bit of public skepticism about getting something for nothing. You see it in polls in the 40s and 50s, often showing support for tighter welfare rules.
The programs were there now.
Exactly. The organizational structure for a big federal role in social services was firmly in place. It's really important to remember that the New Deal laid that organizational foundation for a huge expansion later, even if public opinion was still kind of mixed or wary.
So the framework existed, even if the culture hadn't fully caught up yet.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And even into the early 1960s, within the welfare system itself, there was often still an emphasis on investigating applicants, encouraging family responsibility, those older values. But then comes Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and the War on Poverty in the mid-60s, and that marks another huge turning point.
That era brought massive changes to social welfare, didn't it?
Oh, profound changes. Johnson's vision was ambitious, create a great society, eliminate poverty entirely, and there was a very deliberate effort to remove the stigma associated with receiving welfare.
Make it less shameful.
Exactly. But the book argues this shift in focus away from challenge, moral uplift, personal responsibility towards what it calls lubrication, just providing resources more easily. Well, I ultimately led to increased demands, rocketing government spending, but without a similar drop in poverty rates.
The paradox.
That's the paradox the book highlights, the very thing earlier charity leaders had warned about. That just providing aid without addressing underlying issues or demanding responsibility could have these unintended negative consequences.
And what does the book argue is the lasting legacy of this? What because the entitlement revolution?
Well, the book contends it's had some pretty significant negative results. Things like a decline in social mobility for people at the bottom and a poverty rate that became kind of persistent, even stuck. We've also seen other shifts, like maybe less emphasis on marriage, an increase in single-parent households, and also this growing compassion fatigue among the public, along with a documented drop in individual charitable giving over time.
So the argument is that maybe more government programs inadvertently weakened other supports, like community ties or personal involvement.
That's a central theme, yes. The book suggests a sort of greater acceptance of long-term dependence on public aid developed, and the pressure, maybe even the support networks for people to move off welfare lessened.
Right.
Plus, the welfare system itself became incredibly complex. You have things like the marginal tax wall, where getting a job can actually mean you lose more in benefits than you gain in wages, making it really hard to get ahead.
A trap, almost.
Yeah. And the book points out that even the big increases in spending on homelessness in the 1980s, while maybe well-intentioned, didn't necessarily tackle the root causes effectively.
And the book also mentions something about the language we use,
Yeah.
how that's changed.
Yes, it talks about what the author sees as a corruption of our language. Things like the rise of terms like compassionate conservatism or even just personal compassion. The suggestion is that maybe our understanding of what compassion really is has shifted to, become maybe a bit diluted, losing that element of personal challenge.
So looking back over this whole sweep of history, what key ideas or approaches from the past does the book suggest might hold lessons for us today? How we think about and practice compassion now?
Well, the book really stresses the enduring importance of direct personal involvement and also incorporating challenge alongside support, drawing that parallel with 19th century approaches.
Okay.
It suggests we still need discernment, careful categorization when helping people, recognizing that different people are in different situations and need different kinds of help, distinguishing between someone who needs a temporary hand up and someone who might need a more structured path, maybe even a push towards self-reliance.
That idea of tailoring the help seems really crucial in today's complex world.
Absolutely. Take homelessness, for example. The book argues we need to differentiate clearly between people struggling with severe mental illness, families hit by economic hardship, and those battling substance abuse. They need different solutions.
Oh, right.
It even suggests maybe re-examining things like work tests for able-bodied people in shelters.
And there's a very specific, maybe even provocative example the book gives of applying an old principle to a modern problem.
It does. It's quite striking. It floats the idea of assigning healthy, non-violent homeless individuals the task of holding and comforting drug-addicted babies in hospitals in exchange for a meal.
Wow.
The underlying principle there is that real compassion involves both giving support and offering opportunities for people to contribute meaningfully, to have agency and responsibility. Rooted in a sense of shared humanity and, as the book ultimately argues, maybe a recognition of our dependence on something beyond ourselves. The story of the Timmer family in the Netherlands, risking everything to hide Jews from the Nazis, is used as this powerful example of what truly profound, costly compassion can look like.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the tragedy of American compassion, what's the single biggest takeaway you think emerges from looking at this history?
I think the history shows this really profound transformation. We went from compassion being deeply personal, rooted in community, often involving moral and practical challenges, to a system that's become much more impersonal, bureaucratic, and largely focused on entitlements. And the book argues this shift has had really significant, sometimes damaging consequences for people getting aid and for our communities overall.
And ultimately, the book brings us right back to a really fundamental question about how we live together, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. It keeps asking, how can all of us, human beings with different incomes, different abilities, live well together in these modern, complex, often urban societies? The history, the book suggests, gives us valuable, if sometimes uncomfortable, perspectives on that huge challenge. How we understand and practice compassion is just absolutely central to finding any good answers.
So for you, listening, as you think about these historical shifts in the arguments and the tragedy of American compassion, maybe consider what specific changes in your own actions or in our wider society might lead to a more effective, maybe a more truly compassionate approach to tackling poverty today. It's definitely a question worth mulling over. How do we find that right balance between providing essential support and genuinely fostering responsibility and independence in our communities, and maybe even in our own lives? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.